I will cast her on a bed of suffering. I will strike her children dead. I will repay you according to your deeds. What are we going to do with all of that today? John names Jezebel, and she is connected to two practices: sexual immorality and the eating of foods sacrificed to idols. Those two practices, however, they are not unique to Jezebel in Revelation. In the letter to Pergamum, there are two false groups that are named: the Nicolaitans, they also show up in Ephesus, and those who follow the teachings of Balaam by practicing sexual immorality and the eating of foods sacrificed to idols. A lot of this was going on, apparently. Now, what's interesting here is that Balaam, from the Hebrew he devours, and Nicholas, from the Greek he conquers, along with the name Jezebel, which comes from a very famous story in 1st and 2nd Kings, all seem to be stylized. See, Jezebel was a woman who infamously worshipped Baal, used sexuality for her political aims, and whose corpse was eaten by dogs. Gross. But when you realize all that, you start to get a sense that this is more than just a coincidence. John is doing more here than just naming names. These aren't proper names at all. They're not even pseudonyms for specific teachers. These titles are being used symbolically in Revelation to represent the forces that pull us away from God. In fact, here in Thyatira, along with Jezebel, who's already linked to Nicholas and Balaam, we also get a reference to the so-called deep secrets of Satan. By the way, this is a phrase that unlikely that Christians were going around actually using, talking about the deep secrets of Satan. That would kind of give away the game. No, John is likely being somewhat sarcastic here and turning their slogan back on them. People believed they had access to some deep secret knowledge of God which justified their actions and elevated them above others. And John says, no matter how you couch it, if it's predatory, if it elevates or separates one from another, it all comes from Satan. And so now we have this sort of web of references. Still, we have to talk about the seedy underbelly in this language here. Because both Jezebel and Satan, the synagogue of Satan in particular, these are not neutral terms. And I want to quote from the womanist theologian Will Gaffney here, because she suggests that Jezebel's name has been corrupted into a slur over time. It has, quote, become a byword for a woman of a certain type: assertive, aggressive, sexualized, allegedly promiscuous. In some contexts, her name is synonymous with women who wear makeup or red lipstick or red anything. Black women have regularly been construed as Jezebels and castigated for it. Now, my goal here is not necessarily to try to rehabilitate the Jezebel character from 1st Kings. She's the villain in the story, and that's why John uses her image here. But today, we need to be very cognizant of the years of weaponization embedded in a term like this, and the very loaded nature of this image for women who have perhaps even had this woman thrown at them many times before. Let's remember here that this is a 1st century text we're reading, and certain cultural assumptions about women and power and their placement in society have carried over into the writing. As one scholar, Tina Pippin, writes, power is deprivileged and eventually eliminated in the apocalypse, whereas the ideology of gender is at times revalorized. And so I think it's okay for us to notice that, and then to continue on in the work of eliminating those power imbalances wherever and whenever we see them, precisely the way that I think Revelation ultimately calls us to. But second, we have to talk about the synagogue of Satan. It's another particularly problematic phrase in Revelation, and it's linked here in Thyatira with this reference to the deep secrets of Satan. Now, for the record, this type of heightened apocalyptic language was somewhat par for the course at the time. In the Qumran documents, specifically 1QH2, we find one Jewish community calling another Jewish sect a, quote, gathering of Belial, or literally a synonym for synagogue of Satan. And by the way, Mark Bredin has a really good breakdown of all of this in his book, Jesus, Revolutionary of Peace, a Nonviolent Christology of Revelation. But the point is that this language was, at least initially, probably the product of an internal fight between different Jewish communities that maybe got a little bit too personal. Unfortunately, though, as the Christian church became increasingly Gentile in its makeup, that term started to take on maybe uncomfortably ethnocentric, let's be honest here, racist connotations. To the point where the term synagogue of Satan has compiled a long and sordid anti-Semitic history. And we today absolutely need to be aware of that history if we're even going to touch this term. But I think there are three important ideas that we can ground our understanding of this passage in, given everything we have discussed thus far today. First, Adelo Yarborough Collins talks about what she calls the cathartic release in Revelation. She maintains that Revelation is a non-violent book through and through, a book that is discipling us in the non-violent ways of Jesus. But she argues that non-violence is hard. Maybe even impossible in a world that is full of so much injustice. And so she says that to maintain, to live nonviolence, to follow the way of Jesus in practice, what we need are stories that release our frustration and enable us to justify our ongoing peaceful presence in the world. Essentially, she says that Revelation makes room for our darker nature to be expressed, precisely in order to allow us to follow our better angels in the world. So maybe think of a pacifist coming home after a particularly difficult day and playing a violent video game to release some frustration before returning to her life of peaceful activism. Does that undermine her commitment to doing good in the world? Collins would argue no, not at all. Stories are measured on the outcomes they provoke within us, not on the objective content of the narrative itself. So, for example, reading a violent story that lays bare the tragedy of war, that in itself is the kind of unveiling that moves us toward peace. That's apocalypse. And so here what we might say is that in depersonalizing our enemies, and talking not about our neighbor Bob who does bad things, but about he who devours, and the ways that certain practices can dehumanize and subjugate all of us, how all of that will one day be punished, that can actually help us engage with Bob with a lot more grace. After all, if we know that Bob will eventually be swallowed up by his own practice, perhaps our faithful presence can be part of saving him from that. In other words, Revelation gives us this cathartic release to know that evil will be punished, precisely so that we can go back and engage with real people with real grace and real peace. And I think that can be a way to read this passage that is very faithful to the way of Jesus. We're not cheering for the punishment we read about to be meted out on our neighbors. We are working to disarm death and to turn the story back to good before that happens. Second, though, I think there's hints that the story could be even better. See, if we jump quickly to the city of brotherly love, we find this in chapter 3. I have placed before you an open door that no one can shut. And I will make those who are of the synagogue of Satan come and fall down at your feet and acknowledge that I have loved you. And that's an interesting place for such a heated rivalry to end, right? An open door that no one can shut, perceived enemies coming and bowing down. And that can kind of sound like a humiliating end, but the Greek verb in there, I will make them come, that's the word didomai. And when possible, rendering is to give as an expression of generosity or gift. Meaning that perhaps this open door is really open, even to those we think are captured by Satan, and that one day we will be just as surprised as anyone to see them come and acknowledge what God has loved. And I really like that finally seeing what God loves, that changes everything for all of us. Maybe the gift is for everyone. But there's one final idea to hang our hat on today. And for that, we need to go back and think about Jezebel herself. You see, The simple fact that the children of Jezebel are given a harsher sentence here than she is, that should give us pause. Remember, Jezebel is cast on a bed of suffering, and those who commit adultery with her suffer intensely, but her children, they are killed. And if we're right in our assumptions today that Jezebel and Nicholas and Balaam and the synagogue of Satan, these are not individual people John is pointing a finger at, but instead toxic teachings that take us in unhealthy directions, then I think all of a sudden this maybe starts to make a bit more metaphorical sense. Because what is the offspring of our dalliance with evil? Well, it's the lies we tell ourselves about the world. And those absolutely one day will be put to an end. That's one of the major ideas in Revelation. Lies have a shelf life. But in that light, Jezebel, as the image of those anti-Jesus teachings, finds a fate befitting the Old Testament character she's based on. And the adulterers that she deceives, they do suffer the consequences for their bad choices, just like we do when we make bad choices. But the lies that are born from our mistakes, those will one day die, dissolve. As George Caird writes, the lake of fire is not for men, but instead for the demonic enemies of God. And since the only divine weapon that ever shows up in Revelation is the sword that comes from the mouth of Jesus, just last letter, Jesus said that he would come and fight with the sword from his mouth. That's clearly not a claymore. That's the truth that Jesus fights with. And if that's true, then it makes sense that the only things that truly die in the end are the lies that separate us from God's love. In this light, I think that it becomes clear that this violent image in Thyatira is not speaking violently, it is speaking apocalyptically, calling us to begin to imagine the end of all that brings death to God's good creation. The end, even to the lies we tell ourselves about God. And see, this is the key to reading Revelation through Jesus. Because apocalypses like Revelation, they use violent imagery. It's part of the genre. There's no need to avoid that or pretend it's not true. But John does this because he wants to shock us into seeing the world in new ways. Confronting the things we don't want to see about ourselves, acknowledging the ways that we sometimes play a part in what is wrong with the world without even noticing our complicity. But the violence is never the objective in the story. It's the warning sign on the way back to Jesus. And Jezebel, Nicholas, Balaam, even that synagogue of Satan, these are not enemies you get to point your finger at. These are ideas and temptations, ideologies and perspectives that are very much at work every day in our world, slowly pulling us away from the peace of Jesus.